My name is Mark S. King. I will be your moderator today. This is sponsored by the Reunion Project at reunionproject.net. So let's begin. Making the connection. Long-term survivors discuss loneliness and isolation. Thank you for that, Heather. As with all Reunion Project events, we like to center long-term survivors in this discussion. Hi, everybody. I'm Mark. We'd like to center long-term survivors. So everybody you see and hear from today is a long-term survivor living with HIV. And before I go any further, I just want to wave at our panelists today. We have Katie Willingham. Katie, say hi. Katie is from
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Katie does work with the Well Project. She's been an important translator and a long-term survivor, and I love her voice. I love to hear what she has to say, so thank you for being here. We also have Gina Brown. Say hi, Gina. Gina has been doing work in public health for a long time. She is also, of course, a long-term survivor and is one of the forces behind the Southern AIDS Coalition. So you know that she is the very top of her class, shall we say. Thank you so much for being here, Gina. And then finally, we have David Fawcett, PhD. David is a licensed sex and addiction therapist and also a great friend to the Reunion Project, doing therapy for a long time, including with a lot of long-term survivors. And I know that he'll have a lot of insightful things to say today about loneliness and social isolation. David, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mark, and a long-term survivor myself, I should say.
Oh, thank you. Good. It's always strange to say good for you, but yes, in fact, good.
Another winner.
Yeah. winner, chicken dinner. So let's, I did those housekeeping things already, so good. I wanted to say one thing for myself about social isolation and loneliness before we switch to our panelists, who will be bringing their lived experience to this. And then we'll have David do kind of a clinical perspective from a therapist. We talk a lot about empowerment, in our community, which is obviously an important trait to have. Empowerment comes with a lot of other things. It comes sometimes with the privilege to be empowered. And sometimes it comes with a skill set, which we may or may not always have at our fingerprint tips. Whether I feel truly empowered depends on the day. And I don't know if you've had the same experience, but in the last few years, I've had some very bad days, especially when it comes to feeling alone and isolated and disconnected from the people that give me the energy I need to keep going. And so I wanted you to know that empowerment and feeling lonely or feeling vulnerable or feeling socially isolated, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Even the most empowered among us have our days where we're feeling low and we're feeling disconnected from other people. And so I think that's important to say so that all of us know we're kind of singing off the same sheet of music here, which is that this is something that affects all of us. And I think one reason we know that is because of the response to this webinar. So I'd like to hear from our two panelists who are going to share their lived experience about these issues and then talk and have a little conversation with them. And then talk to David about his viewpoints on this. And then we'll do question and answers from you, the attendees. I'd like to start with Gina. Gina, could you just spend a few minutes talk to us about when you heard the topic, loneliness and social isolation, what came up for you? What has been your experience with that, especially in the last few years, but not just limited to the pandemic? And do you have any tips or any coping mechanisms that you've developed to deal with it? So Gina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yes, I have a lot of experience with isolation. A lot of it was self-imposed, right? At least that's what I thought. I was like, I don't really like being around people, so I can stay inside, I can do these things. But then I realized that it really wasn't self-isolation or self-imposed, excuse me. It was more the fact that ever since 2007, when I came back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, my social network were gone. The people I relied on in this city to go to the movies with, we would do picnics, different things, a bunch of women living with HIV, and all of a sudden I was gone. Fast forward to 2020, and we all know what happened. We were all forced to be inside. And I was like celebrating at first, like, oh, yes, I love being inside. But then I realized that I had no human contact other than my grandson, who I'm sure was tired of me hugging on him and kissing on him. You know, I had nobody else around me really. And it became this thing that I kept thinking about, like, I can pick up the phone and call people. I could call Linda. You know, I talked to Heather a lot during that time. But what about people who have no one? What about people who it's just them? You know, and I felt what that feels like. You know, now that I'm getting older, yes, I got this thing on my head. Y'all can't see all this gray, but it's there. Now that I'm getting older, the isolation is even different, or becoming slightly different. It's more, I don't want to be outside when it's dark. I don't have the same reflexes. I'll be nice, y'all. I don't have the same reflexes I had when I was young. And I don't know if I could run or how fast I could run. I don't know how, you know, so danger is something that I often think about when it comes to the isolation that I'm feeling now, or that I'm sitting in. You know, some of the things that have helped me is I live in New Orleans, y'all, and New Orleans, there's always something to do here, always. I just went to French Quarter Fest this weekend. I'm making an effort to get out. I'm doing some things to get out. I'm calling up friends and saying, we haven't seen each other in a while. Can we go to lunch? You know, I know a lot of places that have outdoor seating, so we can go and sit outside and eat. Last week I was in Chicago at the summit, and I swear I did not know that I missed hugs as much as I did. You know, I was like hugging people that I've never hugged before. And I saw somebody from one of the pharma companies, one of the VPs, and he was sitting there talking to people. And I just jumped on him and hugged him. And he kind of looked startled, you know, but afterwards he said he didn't know he needed that hug also. You know, there are a lot of things that I can do to combat my isolation. Talking about it, being on a panel like this is really, really important. You know, I can remember thinking in the beginning that I was, you know, I was alone in this. I was alone in how I felt. I was alone in missing people and not knowing how to say I miss people. You know, I think for me, it's been a struggle. But when you said empowered, I kind of giggled to myself because I am empowered, right? But I still feel these things. So I don't know if empowerment has anything to do with it. I think empowerment is the thing that allows me to not just feel it, but act on it. So to bring myself out of the isolation and give people a phone call, you know, and all of those things. So I think that's about all I have right now.
Well, that's a lot because you bring
I know.
up, but you know, you bring up some great stuff. There's a lot in there. You know, you talk about aging. You know, most long-term, not all, but most long-term survivors are reaching a certain age. You know, and people like me, you trying to turn on this improvement filter on Zoom to the very top of it, right? There's just a lot of issues associated with getting older. You know, you talk about you don't feel as I don't mean I don't know as confident, perhaps maybe as safe. You know, getting out after dark and all of those things. You know, age has a lot to do with it too, doesn't it? We, you know, just the isolation that comes with aging all by itself, regardless of HIV, regardless of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, I also think when it comes to HIV, for me, I live in a city that a lot of people think New Orleans is a big city, and it really isn't. You know, we don't have 6 degrees of separation. Sometimes it's 2 or 3. If I start calling names, somebody in the room gonna know who I'm talking about, that kind of thing. So I'm so open with my HIV status that people who are not as open really don't want to be with me because it's that guilt by association. I've had family members tell me, that they didn't want to go eat out with me because people have seen us together and then questioned them about their status. So I'm like, wait a minute, y'all feeling stigma over there behind some, I'm trying to live my truth. I'm trying to make sure that people get tested and all those good things. So yes.
Well, and the discomfort that you mentioned that friends might have because you're so out there, and I can relate to my friends feeling discomfort about me being very out there. I can't imagine what it's like for somebody who's just feeling the basic social stigma of HIV. Who maybe their name isn't all over the internet, maybe like yours is, but they're having a hard time really opening up to somebody and finding the intimacy that comes with social connection because they can't share all that they are.
Yeah.
You know,
We see that a lot.
You mentioned a conference. I saw pictures from that conference too, the prevention conference, and seeing lots of old friends hugging. And I was so envious that I wasn't there. But I also thought, boy, I'm glad you were there. I was envious because you had an opportunity to do something and be with people that we know each other, right? A lot of people in this who are attendees right now, they don't go to those conferences. They're not in the field or whatever. It's not an opportunity they have, and so they don't get that. They don't get that once a year or twice a year. Being around a bunch of people with HIV, where it's okay, where it's a harder struggle. Gina, thank you so much. And we'll be talking again in a few minutes once David's shared some things. Katie, you've already heard some things from Gina about just the general isolation of the pandemic. I'm wondering what kind of struggles you've had in terms of your identity or your HIV status, or what sorts of things prevent you from reaching out for connection with other people, and what it might contribute to a sense of loneliness. I'm not projecting. I just want to hear from you about that.
Absolutely. But to some degree, we're talking about isolation, and to some degree, I feel like for lack of a better term, a professional isolationist. As a lifelong introvert, I've always, growing up, I moved around a lot, and I never really had many friends. I stayed home in my room drawing and writing and not developing many social skills. um, so, to some degree, I've always been used to isolation. I've always dealt with it fairly well too, until I was diagnosed with HIV. After being diagnosed with HIV, that's a whole different level of isolation. And being an introvert never bothered me so much until my diagnosis, because it, I guess to some degree, self-imposed isolation isn't so, is one thing but when, the isolation that comes with HIV is totally different. But yeah, I've always dealt with isolation, by hobbies and puppies and things like that. But it's still hard, even for someone like me who's used to it. Isolation and it's still really hard, and you have your hard times, especially when I especially feel it when when it comes to dating and trying to trying to find a relationship, because I have what I call my hand grenades of HIV and being transgender, that makes finding people especially in the South where I'm from extremely difficult. Um, I'm pretty isolated where I live. Uh, uh, being in the South, there's a lot of education needed around here, and I've even as much as I've tried to educate my family, and before they disowned me for being transgender, I educated them about HIV, but a lot of members would, still avoided me, and and uh, you know, and that was really hard. um, I guess I dealt with it by you know uh, the first 15 years, first 15 years of my diagnosis. um, I largely stayed home. I didn't know anything about U equals U, and I was afraid in my own home with my own family. I felt isolated with people around me. I felt isolated with people I loved and who loved me, because I was afraid of being intimate. I was afraid of playing with my children a lot of times. Uh, there was, I had a lot of those fears. So I felt, for 15 years after my diagnosis, I felt completely isolated, even in my own home. Um, and it took finding out about U equals U, which you know changed everything for me, but not for not for everyone else yet. Like I said, there's still a lot of education that's needed, and um, uh, but I came to place. I guess I found a lot of peace by finding my people. Um, when I got into advocacy, uh, uh, not just learning about U equals U changed my life, but the people I have met in this field have changed my life. These the advocacy a lot, much of the advocacy community has become my family, and I don't know what I would do without that, without that connection, without this beautiful community that we have. um, and that's, I guess that's as far as isolation and helping my isolation, that's meant the world to me, is finding this community, uh, and in finding this community, I found enough peace to to uh, uh, to better find myself. I was on the path of finding myself after coming out, uh, and beginning my transitioning. um, I was already on that path, but but finding supportive people and a supportive community really has really helped me in several of my journeys of both living with HIV, living as a woman of transgender experience, and quite frankly living as a Southern woman. um, Finding this community has helped me tremendously, and that's that and puppies. I recommend puppies.
You know, you've got a lot. You also have a lot to say there, Katie, and thank you first of all for sharing all of that. A few things. When you talk about you found this community, a lot of people, you know, I'm first of all I'm glad they found this webinar and they're here as attendees. But if they're looking for community beyond this, and where do you find that? A good place to start would be reunionproject.net, the sponsor of this. There's also a Facebook page for the Reunion Project where you can post and begin conversations about being a long-term survivor. There's also all sorts of other coalitions of people living with HIV that address, you know, various, you know, this is Southern AIDS Coalition. There is Positively Trans, Positive Women's Network. Lots of organizations like that. I hope I didn't just run those by you too quickly, that you can look up that have activities and things going on that might help draw you closer to the kind of community you're talking about, Katie. But more specifically, something you said, you talked about being an introvert, and I wonder if we put too much pressure on when we say you need to be empowered and all of that. It sounds like, I hope we're not asking people to do more than they're naturally inclined to do. In other words, if you're an introvert, you're an introvert. You know, and so it must be a hard, steep hill to ask people to be suddenly become extroverted and go out there and find friends or you know it. And it sounds like there's some things that you did to deal with being a loner, like art, and things that you did in your alone time where it sounds like you weren't lonely, you were alone, but you were expressing yourself through your art and things like that. I'm wondering do we put too much emphasis on having lots of friends and being part of this big community, as opposed to also being able to enjoy or be okay with being alone and doing things for yourself by yourself? It seems like you've been able to do that, Katie.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's too much emphasis on that. I think it's there. I think people have always let me know that it's there if I want it, if I need to reach out. But sorry, I completely forgot the first part of the question. But
no, thank you for all of that, and I appreciate it. And you'll be joining us as well, kind of after we wrap up with David and have a conversation. David, as the identified therapist in the room, I don't want to put too much pressure on you to come up with all sorts of answers and great helpful hints for all of this. We know that sometimes there aren't answers. We know that sometimes we of all people know that sometimes there aren't easy answers to things we're facing in life. But that said, what is your response to what you're hearing from Gina and Katie, and what do you have to say for all this?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. First of all, I just want to express appreciation for both Gina and Katie for their vulnerability and just expressing these feelings. And I know all of us are probably used to being on a public stage fairly frequently, but still this stuff is very personal. And I think it takes a little bit of courage to do that. So I just want to acknowledge that. I guess what I'm hearing, and I'm resonating with a bunch of this stuff myself from my own personal experience, I guess the way I'd kind of draw some of this together are I like to think of these as kind of, we're hitting on different elements of what I call kind of resilience. And I think when we're talking about elements of emotion and isolation and the things that affect particularly people living with HIV and in adverse circumstances like a pandemic, or just the situation of living with HIV, where we're feeling somewhat isolated, we have to really start to build those different skill sets that I kind of cluster under resilience. And I think a couple of those were brought up. One is self-care. Right. And self-care is broad. It can be physical self-care, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. But I heard it with Gina talking about just being conscious of safety, physical safety. You know, we think of self-care sometimes as eating well and sleeping and all that. And it is all of that. But it's also acknowledging when we have to be careful, protecting ourselves, I identify because I have neuropathy and I'm not as careful on my feet as I used to be, right? I've started to be at safety in terms of physical movement. So I think just those kinds of things, being aware of that. I think just what I heard both Katie and Gina talk about, what I would call a compound isolation, starting out maybe as an introvert and having HIV on top of that, and then having a gender issue on top of that, and just all of those things that kind of compound and just kind of, they're layers that make it almost that much more hard to dig out from under. And so I think that's where that resilience also is really incredibly important. Aging, all these things are factors. I think there's a couple of tasks that I think are really helpful in all this. Katie, I was struck when you were talking about those years of living with your family and the shame that must have gone on, the silence, the lack of acceptance, both in your community and within the family. I think all of us have to shed a lot of shame and experience a lot of grief. Those kinds of things can just weigh us down in the middle of this process. But along with that then comes these positive skills where we can, I think, start to really increase those real-time social connections. And I think the connections really are the key to all of this, right? That's what really feeds us. And then within that, whether it's puppies, by the way, or human beings, and I'm a big puppy, I believe in the magic of puppies myself. But along with that, then when we have people we can talk to, then we can start to practice compassion and empathy. And I think then we start getting into the real magic sauce here, because if we can start to practice compassion and empathy, both for ourselves and for other people, that's when these human connections, even if they're brief, even if they're by phone, although ideally in person, really start to make a difference. And I think that's when we start to kind of be able to come into ourselves. And I think kind of the ultimate in this is kind of finding a purpose. And I heard both Katie and Gina talk about their advocacy work and kind of how that was almost transformative in terms of finding purpose and kind of having something to kind of focus on and move forward. And that brings me to my last point, which is something that I just want to introduce a concept that I think a lot of people may not be aware of. And it's a thing, it's research-based, and it's called post-traumatic growth. And a lot of people are surprised by it. Everybody's sort of post-traumatic stress, and that's a real thing too. But this is a new, fairly newly researched thing, last 10 or 15 years, that looks at trauma, and it doesn't mean that trauma is anyway a good thing. Trauma is traumatic. Trauma is never a good thing. But what this research shows is that some people are able to take a bad event, an adverse event, a traumatic event, and somehow convert that into something that benefits them or others. And they do that with resilience. They do that with personality factors. Sometimes it's luck. Sometimes it's other people. But I just want to show the areas that this sometimes manifests in, this post-traumatic growth, because there's 5 areas that research shows this could happen. And I know in my own life, really, it's manifested in many different ways too, as a result of my own diagnosis with HIV back in the 80s. One of the first areas, new opportunities. And I think I heard Katie talk about, finding her people and advocacy. And certainly as a result of this diagnosis, I switched careers and I became a therapist, and I found that I became a healer, and I'm a good healer, and I'm an advocate, and I'm a writer. And I found all these things that I had no idea that I even knew. And so in that way, my HIV diagnosis really led to this whole other life that I might not have ever known about, really. Changes in relation to others. We find when we go through different trauma, we are able to relate more and get closer to other people. We can form bonds in sometimes deeper ways than we could before, because we've been near the edge. We've been to the edge and looked over that cliff. And I think that somehow gives us the capacity to form relationships that are maybe of a different quality than they might have been before that trauma occurred. 3 more. There's a greater sense of personal efficacy. I think those of us that have gone through these kind of traumas and survived have a kind of I guess what a therapist would call a sense of agency, right? We have a sense that maybe I can make a difference in my life. I'm not a victim. I'm not passive. I can actually do something about my own life and make a change in it. And I think that's that empowerment is incredibly invigorating for people. And then I think 2 other things, kind of a more general way. There's a greater appreciation for life. I think those of us that, again, have gone through a near miss or near misses really start to appreciate every day. And I think, and when I get a little stale and take life for granted, I give myself a 30-day gratitude challenge, right? I do a gratitude list every day for 30 days. And that really does turn my attitude around, and it makes a huge difference. And then finally, the research shows that when people have this post-traumatic growth, there's a huge area in terms of spiritual development. There's a whole spiritual life that often opens up, not always, but it can open up for people in terms of like, okay, what's all this about? You know, why have I gone through this? What's the point? What's the meaning, and what's the purpose of this? And how can I use that going forward with the rest of my life? So I think these are like big questions, of course, but I think it all boils down to us as individuals facing moments like this in our houses, in our lives today, and how we kind of approach it and move forward and connect with each other and support each other and have compassion, not only for ourselves, but for each other out there. So, yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. You bring up a lot. The compound isolation concept is very interesting to me, because a lot of us are dealing with layers of things that might work against us when it comes to finding community. Something else that occurs. Well, first I want to ask you what I was kind of asking Katie. I'm going to ask the therapist now, and that is, some of us are maybe not built to be out there making all sorts of friends and doing the kind of tasks that you're suggesting. In other words, maybe we're just not well suited for it. We don't know how to. Is it possible to deal with isolation in a way that addresses the fact that we're also introverts? And maybe there's ways to deal with being alone without truly being lonely. You know, I'm not saying, you know, instead of, but maybe as part of, because even those of us who are super social, I still find myself being alone, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling.
Right, right. And I would say I'm an introvert too. I really, at first at least, kind of thrived on sort of shutting down and being by myself with my partner. I was kind of locking the door. We were happy for a couple of months, then started to get to me. But yeah, I think people that are kind of wired that way, not everybody needs or wants a cast of thousands around them, right? So I think it's totally fine. I think what we do need, though, even if we're the most extreme introvert, we need people, and we need at least a few close relationships that we can confide in. We need trust, we need vulnerability, we need accountability, we need other human beings we can bounce ideas off of. And I think, and I was joking about dogs before, but I'm a big dog person, and I relate to my dogs, and I have friends that only relate to their dogs, and that's great, but we need other people. And I think so the most extreme introverts among us really need, I think, to make an effort to at least have one or two, and it only takes one or two really good relationships, two really good, strong friends, where you're vulnerable with people, there's a little level of intimacy. And by that I mean, we can share stuff with that person. There's some trust there. It doesn't take a lot of those relationships. I would say one or two, even three. For the most introverted person, that can do perfectly fine to have really great mental health, right? It doesn't take a cast of thousands, but I think it does take that human connection.
You know, I relate to that, because for a while I was on this kick where I was asking friends of mine who seemed to be like the most popular of the people, and the people everybody knew, you know, and I for a while I started asking them, how many friends do you have? I mean, like close friends, like they call you for no reason, just to see, to hang out. How many do you have? And these people that I describe would say 2, 3. You know, people who you would think, oh, they got all sorts of friends. You know, they don't, especially if it's somebody that you really like and you would like to see in your life as a friend, and you think, oh, they probably have plenty of friends. You know, I always said at our age, if you want to make friends with someone, you got to stalk them. I mean, you really have to call, and you have to make an effort and show them, no, I'm really interested in you. I want to hang out. And for me, as kind of involved as I am, I have 2 phone calls that are regular every day. My best friend and my brother, whom I love. 2. You know, those are my go-tos and my sounding boards for most everything. So I point well taken. It doesn't take a cast of thousands.
But what does worry me, Mark, are people that don't have anybody, right? And that's not a good situation. And I think that's why I really encourage people to take advantage of things like the Reunion Project or other kinds of organizations. There are networks out there. There are I think that's one area where HIV world has done a good job out of necessity, right? In the early days, there was nothing else but us. And so we had buddy programs and we learned how to connect. And I think there are ways to network with other people. And I think we have to do it. There's opportunities, but it's essential to get out there. We can't do it literally in isolation.
Something that I think you mentioned grief, and something that occurred to me is even in the last 3 years, as we've all been locked up, the world has gone on. I mean, life and death still happen. Babies are born and relatives die. And I have a few people that I know well that have lost family members, and either they didn't have the opportunity to grieve properly, or they had to grieve alone, or they couldn't go to the funeral. Even in the worst of it, right? It was these things go on, and the emotional outlets that we used to think we had, especially for, dealing with processing something big like a death in the family. We haven't had those rituals. We haven't had a chance to properly get it out of our system.
Right. I remember, like everybody, I didn't lose close family members, but parents of close friends and distant relatives, things like that. I lost a lot of people and acquaintances. And I remember President Biden and the Harrises were at a thing at the Lincoln Memorial on television, right? And they had the reflective pool in the Washington Monument was all lit up to celebrate, or to honor, I should say, all the people that died of COVID. And it was this beautiful illuminated ceremony. And I saw it on TV, and I burst into tears. I wept, and I was like, where did that come from? And I realized it was the first kind of acknowledgement or opportunity to like grieve this probably 18 months worth of accumulated grief that had just never been expressed before. And I realized we probably all have that as a society that's still unexpressed. And I think that it's just so important. And I think nobody knows that better than people living with HIV, that we need to keep that grief moving out. And grief is not meant to be held on to, right? Grief is meant to be experienced and released. And I'm a big believer in rituals for releasing it. And whether that's a good cry or some memorial services, or writing and burning, or taking a medicine bundle to the water and to the beach, or whatever you want to do. But I think it's really important to really acknowledge that and release it, because it's not good for us physically, emotionally, or spiritually to be carrying it around like we are. I think it weighs us down.
My go-to is I watch dog rescue videos. I mean, they come across my Facebook feed because now Facebook knows I love them. And, oh, it's the little dog and he's under the car and he's scared to come out. Now he does, and he looks awful. And then they fix him up and he's all happy, and I'm bawling. And I know it's about more than the dog.
Right.
It's about more than the dog. It's about, I don't get to hug people anymore. It's been a long time.
And by the way, I should say laughter is equally an essential release, right? Laughter, anybody that's had a good belly laugh knows how relaxed they feel afterwards. I mean, that's a physiological release anyway. So if you can find happy videos, was my point here, it's equally cathartic.
Yeah, I laugh at myself enough, so I'm good there. But
Okay.
yes, it makes a lot of sense. I want to bring back in Gina and Katie as we talk more about this. I was scanning the comments as they were whizzing by, and people were talking about the kind of compound isolation factors that you talk about, David. Somebody mentioned race and how race plays a role in further isolating people.
Absolutely.
Certainly, Katie touched upon, being trans and how that kind of, piles things on. Gina or Katie, would you like to chime in on that, on kind of the additional layers that we have to deal with beyond HIV, or beyond, or maybe even including geography, and how, geographically isolated we might be. Are you still with us, Gina? I know you were having connection problems. Oh, there she is.
Yes, when it got real unstable, I just went off camera. So
Yeah, that's okay.
so I can still be here.
Well, somebody,
yes,
I don't need to go ahead, Gina.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say I'm glad they brought up race, because I think, especially if you think about 2020, when we first started happened to be in isolation because of COVID, right? And we saw all of the uprising, the different things that were happening. That makes me want to stay inside even more. I don't know about other people, and I'm not a criminal. I was in a previous life. I am a reformed criminal. But when I see the police, I still get heart palpitations. So I'd rather stay inside and not have to deal with anything that's gonna, make me feel or really upset me in that way. So I stay inside because I don't want to have to deal with it. I don't want to have to deal with the racial stuff. I don't want to have to deal with any of that. And then a lot of times when I think about like where I live and some of my neighbors or whatever, and I'm like, they just don't know my community, my family. We're the rainbow people. We're everybody. We love everybody and each other. It's different for us. So I think when we're in our environment, in our natural habitat, when I'm in my natural neighborhood, the way I feel here is different than the way I feel at a conference surrounded by people that I know care about me. But it is a thing. And I wanted to tell y'all something that also happened to me right before we went into the lockdown. I came out as a bi woman. So that was even more places where I could be shunned, and I imposed isolation on myself because I didn't know how people would deal with it. As old as I am, I still worry about how people feel, or, how my mama feel most of more than anything. So that's one of the things also that I had to deal with.
Well, I'd like to say welcome to the rainbow, Gina. That's very. I thought for a minute you said in isolation I decided I was a bi woman. I'm like, how did you decide that in isolation? But okay, I'm very proud of you for bringing that up. I am. So we have every part of that spectrum here with us today. That is great. There was a couple of other things that people had mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm losing my place here. Katie, you want to chime in?
I'm sure. Yeah. Being trans on top of HIV has made isolation a lot more difficult. I mean, when I was just HIV positive, a lot of people avoided me, and then that, of course, that intensified when I came out as transgender, and largely this, especially the neighborhood I live in, is not a very welcoming or safe space. So so I still deal with isolation and the stigma that goes that comes with living with HIV and being transgender in the South. But I found that whereas before I found peace in finding my people, I've also being a woman living with HIV, being a woman of transgender experience, I found peace in finding myself, and that's I think that's it was really important. It was really important for me. I don't, it's hard to be completely alone when you're comfortable with yourself, when you have yourself, but uh, yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you, Katie. You know,
Sorry.
something occurred to me while we were talking, and we were talking about rituals or things that we do. And one good habit I have gotten into during the pandemic is, you know, these Zoom meetings, they don't just exist because somebody puts on a webinar. You folks out there, if you want to Zoom with somebody, you can. You know, if you know, you do, I think a membership in Zoom is a few bucks a month or something, but boy, has it been a good investment in my part. Every Sunday morning at 9 a.m., me, my brother, girlfriend of mine, a good friend of mine, the four of us get together. It's a date every Sunday morning, 9 a.m. And they all have the Zoom link. It's the same one we use every week. And we get together and we're drinking our coffee. It's Sunday morning at 9 a.m. And we read The Ethicist, which is this column in a newspaper which goes over these ethical dilemmas. And you have to, it's kind of like reading a Dear Abby column. And I read the problem and everybody says what they think the answer should be. And it's all well and good, but really it's just an opportunity for all of us to gossip and bitch and tell what happened to us during our week or whatever. And it's a check-in for us. And I'll tell you, it works. It has been a great outlet for all of us to feel as if we're hanging out together again. And so it's really worked. I also see somebody in the chat room talking about drag shows and strippers. And so, hey, whatever works for you, then I'm all for it. David, you know, we've talked a lot about some serious stuff about isolation, and I'm wondering when loneliness goes into depression. You know, it goes into something that maybe we're talking something that might be more serious. How do people know the difference? How do we know when it's not so much I need more friends, but I might need to talk to somebody. I might need to seek out professional help. What's the difference between loneliness and, oh my gosh, I'm clinically depressed?
Yeah, that's a great point. And before I get there, I just want to touch on something you said before about your Sunday morning calls. Those kind of regular rituals, I think, are very grounding in our lives. If we do the same stuff, same routines, not to the point where it's monotonous, but it's just like it kind of, so our days, like they know our days have started, or that Sunday ritual. It's a nice way to kind of just give our lives a sense of being grounded, and like Sunday's here and it's normal.
And it's a lot of fun. And it's not the sort of thing I thought I would ever do, you know. I know we'll see how this goes, but it's been great.
So, but you bring up a really important point, because when we're talking about loneliness, isolation, it starts to swirl around, and it's very easily transformed into something a little darker, right? And that's depression and major depression. And we know that just those of us living with HIV in any given year, about 40% of us meet the criteria for major depressive disorder. So
40% of people living with HIV.
So, and whether we're undetectable or not. And so there's a high correlation of mood disorders with HIV. And so we have to be alert to it anyway. And so I think we're susceptible to it. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to know the signs and symptoms. And just because you're lonely doesn't mean you're depressed, by the way. But the signs and symptoms basically are worsening of symptoms. And it's a little confusing because sometimes they're opposite. You can have excess appetite or no appetite, right? You can have a lot of sleep or no sleep. But in general, our moods get darker. We tend to withdraw more. We tend to get more isolated. We tend to get more kind of hopeless and passive, and the world gets a little darker and smaller. I think that's when I hear people subjectively talk about the experience of depression, it's like the world gets kind of small and dark. And I think and unfortunately, what goes often with that is an increasing inability sometimes to reach out for help. You become kind of closed off from that self-efficacy that I was talking about, that empowerment to do something. And so I think it's incumbent on us to watch the symptoms. I think most HIV care providers who do our prescriptions and stuff monitor this fairly carefully, although it's really incumbent on us to monitor ourselves and our mental health in that regard. But we are at risk for us, all of it, for loneliness, depression, anxiety as well, by the way. But I think if we stay connected, the single most protective thing we can do against depression is those social networks, those healthy, robust groups of friends that we have, that we interact with regularly, that we're in contact with, that kind of give us life, literally. I think that's the key. in this.
You know, there was a comment in the chat room I noticed while you were talking about this. It was somebody said, you know, our doctors don't even acknowledge it, or they don't even know how to deal with it. You know, we go to our medical doctor, you know, it was probably our HIV doc, probably, you know, but whatever, some medical doctor. And it's funny, they often don't acknowledge or pick up any sort of signals about how we're doing emotionally. And so then we must leave that doctor appointment and think we're fine when
Yeah.
that loneliness might have turned into something darker.
Yeah, and unfortunately that I've seen that too, because people are busy. Doctors are kind of trained to focus on lab results and they're not really looking at the whole person in many cases, unfortunately, and the time is short. And so I think, you know, this is a case again where we have to become advocates for ourselves and really push up and speak up if we think, and that's, by the way, obviously, if we're feeling depressed, all that much harder to do. But that's where I think having friends, having buddies, you know, I've taken friends with me to my doctor's appointments to help me find a voice if I'm having trouble kind of describing stuff. So I think, you know, that's where we have to rely on allies and friends to help us in those situations. But it's true that providers may miss it, especially if they're just seeing us for the briefest snapshot, you know, every 4 months or 6 months. So I think it's really important to find ways we can speak up and see it when it's happening. By the way, there are all over the internet, there are brief assessments for depressive disorders. The one kind of the gold standard is the Beck Depression Inventory. It's brief, it's 20-some questions, it's all over the internet, and it's easy to take and it's reliable for the most part.
And it's called the what inventory?
Beck, B-E-C-K, Beck Depression Inventory.
Okay, all right. You know, it sounds kind of like a vicious cycle a little bit in terms of you're lonely and you might be depressed, but depression kind of takes away your willingness or your get up and go, and so then you don't talk to anybody about your depression.
It does
Right.
kind of lead that way, right? That's why it's so important to interrupt it in the beginning when it's still manageable or more manageable.
Right. Well, certainly anybody that's attending this webinar has already demonstrated they're proactive, right?
Sure, for sure.
I know that there has been a lot of questions whizzed by and that I haven't caught them all. I know that Heather is doing her best to pay attention. But if you've been if you've had questions that we haven't gotten to and you want to use this time now, I'm going to ask that we kind of devote our chat for the next few minutes to any questions that you don't think that have been addressed. And or Heather, if you want to chime in with anything you've noticed that you would like to see us discuss in the last few minutes we have. It is now 8 o'clock. We're going to take the next 15 minutes to address those questions and answers. Will we continue recording, Heather, or will we say goodbye now to our recorded audience?
So at 8:15, we will end our recording, and the last 15 minutes of the session will not be recorded. So if you'd rather ask your question when the recording is not happening, please feel free to do so. But Mark, I have a lot of questions for you.
Oh, you do? Well, Mr. Wizard, please, by all means.
Okay, so lots of people at advocacy groups and coalitions are doing great things to help us connect, stay healthy, etc. But each group is doing its own thing. Are there any central websites where people can find a list of groups, who they are, where they are, and what they do and offer?
That's a great question. I don't know if Katie or Gina are involved in the People Living with HIV caucus. The National Caucus is a group of all of where it's kind of a membership group, as it were, of all of those small little coalitions, all of those little groups are small, or any group, large or small, of people living with HIV come under the umbrella of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. And if you're there, thank you very much. Somebody just helpfully put the link on the chat room. If you go there, I don't know if they explicitly have a list of all of those places. Gina, do you know of anything else?
No, not just what you said. But I also wanted to give a plug to something that I just got a new therapist, and I got her through Therapy for Black Girls. And I kept looking and looking, and it was like this woman just jumped off the page. And when the first time we met, it was just a connection. I think it's somebody I can really work with. So if there's a therapist in your area, get a therapist if you need one, you know. And if you're Black and you think you don't need one, you do. You do.
You know, I was able to get therapy through my local community-based clinic, and because sometimes you don't have the copay, you know, and sometimes you're going to pay the whole thing, or you're going to pay at least $25 a session. That might be out of range for some folks, and so your local community-based organization or your local SAMHSA mental health organization there might be able to help you with that. But I like that. Did you say Therapy for Black Girls? Is that the name of it?
That's great.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So Heather, what else did we have?
Let's see. We have some questions in the Q&A here. What are the percentages of HIV/AIDS patients picking up drugs and alcohol as opposed to finding recovery, treatments, and community?
Wow, what a big question. I want to first mention that someone's just pointed out in the chat room that you're right, Ryan White will cover copays for anything insurance doesn't cover. I'm assuming that they mean for mental health services as well. Good to know if you're a Ryan White patient. David, the issue of addiction and alcohol has come up, and I imagine you have something to say considering that's one of your expertise.
Yeah, I spent about 30 years working with guys living with HIV who use crystal meth and act out sexually. That's kind of been my world for a long time. Unfortunately, we see a whole bunch of co-occurring use of alcohol, drugs, and HIV. I think both leading to becoming, to seroconverting, and then also afterwards. So it's a very high problem still. It remains, despite a lot of work and a lot of money over the years. There's still probably 20-30% co-occurring issues of people getting in trouble with addiction who are living with HIV. And it tends to be toward the amphetamine side of things. And now lately, the last 5 years, we're seeing also opioids tacked onto that. So we're seeing both epidemics affecting people with HIV. And unfortunately, I don't see anything improving in that regard. It kind of goes in waves. I know we'll have more coming out around Pride Month this year, more information on that. But the trends really are bad. There's a lot of statistics coming out. For example, meth overdoses among gay men tripled over the last couple of years again. And so, and many of those were men living with HIV. So it's grim. And I think basically it's the same stuff we're talking about today. The isolation and loneliness, combine that with the shame, the grief, the lack of resources, the feeling of isolation, the multiple stigmatized identities. I mean, all the weight of all that stuff, I think, takes its toll. And people don't have resources, people don't have supports, people don't have coping mechanisms, or they turn to things that'll either help distract them from it or numb those feelings. And I think it's incumbent on us as a community to really reach out and support those people and help them as best they can.
And it is widespread, all sorts of substances and all sorts and alcohol. And by that, I mean, a lot of people take their comfort where they can, especially when they're stressed out and isolated. And something that was maybe helpful as a coping mechanism 5 years ago has become something else now.
Totally. It can turn on you very fast. What is a kind of a nice escape suddenly is a whole other problem in your life.
David, if somebody should seek out professional help for this, somebody was mentioning in the chat that they've had to fire therapists or go through some that were not equipped to deal with them as a long-term HIV/AIDS survivor. It made me smile. I went to a therapist through a community group because I couldn't afford, any copay. Not that they weren't otherwise great, but as soon as this therapist found out that I'd been living with HIV for 30 years, they were like, "Oh, tell me more. That must be terrible." And I could tell that was there for their entertainment. I was there for, oh, this will make a great paper. Or, it's like they were more interested for themselves in what I had been through.
Right.
And I was pretty much like, no, I've processed that. I'm really here for this other thing, for this other issue, quit, anyway.
I think if it's really good to vet people either through agencies, HIV service organizations, or I think the best possible thing is through your peer networks. Talk to your friends if they have a therapist, if there's, the grapevine, because I think that's often the best, the word of mouth. And I really want to endorse what Gina said. What she said was this therapist she found, she really like resonated with this person. It fit. And I think that's totally fine. You don't go to the first therapist you find, you go to a therapist you fit with. And it's okay if you don't fit with the therapist, say, ciao, baby, I'm going on to the next one. And that's perfectly fine, because you need, not every therapist is a match for everybody, and you have to find that right fit. And that's absolutely fine.
And we may not be as expert on choosing therapists as we may have become choosing an HIV doc. I've fired a few of those too, and so maybe we don't feel equipped or too shy to say this ain't working for me. But obviously, it's something we should be able to do.
Yeah.
Heather, what else do we have from our room as we're wrapping up the last few minutes of our recorded time? And I'm going to keep an eye on this chat room in case anybody wants to throw out something that I might have missed.
So we actually have someone with their hand raised that would like to ask a live question. So I'm going to go ahead and allow them to talk now.
Great.
So if you're coming off mute now, and go ahead and ask your question. Hopefully it works.
Hey, Tristan, we should be able to hear you. Can you hear us? No, okay.
Maybe we'll try going back. Let's ask another question.
Okay.
So there's a question about the correlation between PTSD and the concept, or what about the PTSD concept of being a long-term survivor?
Right. So PTSD, of course, is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is kind of the endpoint of somebody who's experienced trauma. Not everybody who experiences trauma ends up with PTSD. That's kind of the extreme endpoint of that. For the reasons we've kind of highlighted tonight, with these different kind of issues, whether it's the cumulative effect of not only HIV, but often substance use, history of violence, trauma in our past, racial issues, gender issues, sexual orientation issues, all these different issues kind of come together in the same individual. And I think when we see these, what therapists would call, I guess, stigmatized identities, or when we have these kind of things that we're trying to deal with in society, the cumulative weight of those put us at increased risk for PTSD. And so if it were just HIV, we might be able to handle it. If it were just alcoholism, we might be able to handle it. But when we have 3, 4, 5, 10 of these things together, it just overwhelms our capacity to deal with it. And in those circumstances, PTSD can develop. Now, the good news, there's really effective treatments for PTSD. The last 5 years have been amazing in terms of getting really good therapies for PTSD. So I'm very hopeful about that, but it's a matter of connecting with somebody. It tends to be expensive therapy, it's specialized therapy, and it's hard to access sometimes. But if you can get to it, it's very effective.
Thank you, David. In the last few minutes that we have, I just want to take a moment before we end the recording, although we will continue this conversation for those of us who are attendees live here. But as we end this recorded segment, I do want to, of course, thank the Reunion Project and remind you that if you want more information about them, go to reunionproject.net. And also check the Facebook page where you can actually post something or start a conversation at the Reunion Project. On Facebook online. I'd also want to thank Katie, who is such a great resource for us, and working with the Well Project and doing some beautiful writing, by the way, about your experience living with HIV, Katie. Congratulations on that. I'm a big fan of that. And Gina Brown with the Southern AIDS Coalition, who left something on the stove, I think, today to be with us because she's always cooking. And of course, David Fawcett, a real friend to the Reunion Project and your expertise. A lot has come up today. There's a couple of takeaways I have heard. A lot of that is reaching out, maybe volunteering. I saw the word volunteer in the chat room a lot. One of my best friends deals with this by going to his local ASPCA and giving those poor dogs in those cages walks. He just volunteers and he takes them, and he's he's approved, and he goes to the park with them and takes them for a walk, brings them joy, helps them see other people. All these people saying "cute dog" in interaction. It's great. And then the other thing that is a big takeaway for me is post-traumatic growth. We know a lot about the first part of that phrase, trauma, and what we've been through as long-term survivors. To put growth at the end of that really means a lot. I love that idea that we can walk through what we have and continue to grow and continue to figure out tools for what it is we've done. So I want to again thank all of these panelists. We're going to continue our conversation live, and this webinar will be available on social media later in its recorded version. And thank you all for being here. Oh, the
Thanks.
poll. Oh my
Yes.
goodness. Oh, the
Yes,
poll.
the
Thank you, Heather.
poll.
Okay, before
You're
we
welcome.
leave you, take a look at this, everybody. On the scale of 1 to 5, how enjoyable was today's session? 1 being least enjoyable, 5 being most. How do you do this? Do I just click on the thing?
We can vote.
How do I make
Yeah.
this work? Oh, I can't vote. Oh, I can't vote. I don't want to say how great it was, I guess. Okay, if y'all would take a few minutes, the attendees in the room, and on a scale of 1 to 5, I guess 5 meant that it was you really liked it a lot. And would you consider attending a session in the future? That's a yes or no question. And thanks for the 7, the person in the chat room. Thank you. Although I don't want to unfairly influence anyone. So please answer that honestly and take a few minutes. Just click on the screen, someone says, and to answer it. We're going to leave that up there for only a few more seconds, 5 more seconds probably. And I want to thank Heather as well for her help in the background for getting this done today. And I really do appreciate that. Okay, Heather. Again, thank you all. This is a goodbye to our recorded audience from the Reunion Project. I hope this was helpful, and thanks very much.